Well, Kevin Courtney is the Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union, which represents 450,000 teachers and support staff in England and Wales. Now, if the reports are correct, Kevin, health workers will be exempt from this public sector pay freeze, but teachers will be included. However, teachers agreed a pay rise earlier this year. You were part of the nearly 1 million public sector workers who were given an above inflation increase. So where does this leave you?
Well, we don't know what the Chancellor's going to say next week. Like you said, Krishnan, they've been so worried about teacher recruitment that they've promised that starting teacher salaries will increase by about 7% a year for 3 years to 30,000 because they had so many problems recruiting teachers. We don't know what's coming next week. But I have to say, this isn't about fairness at all. This is a con job. This is they say it's about holding down, cutting public sector pay because private sector pay has gone down. But it just makes no sense. Public sector workers spend their pay rises in private sector retail, private sector hospitality, private sector hairdressers. It's an attack on all working people, and it makes no sense economically.
But the argument is that in the private sector, a lot of people have had to go on to 80% of their earnings because they've been furloughed or they've lost their jobs, and the private sector has been hit harder than the public sector. Does that, do you see any merit in this argument that, things need to be evened out? I mean, it's certainly not levelling up, but is there a question of taking your fair share of pain?
This is an attempt at a typical Tory divide and rule, I'm afraid. And pay for public sector workers goes into private sector retail, like I said, police officers, prison officers, school support staff, teachers, head teachers, DWP workers, hospital ancillary staff. They're all on the front line and they're putting their lives on the line, and they should get a pay rise. But so should the Tesco and Aldi delivery drivers. We're all in this together, working people. I think we have to look at what the Labour government... It was, and it wasn't true from him. But we have to look at what the Labour government did after in 1945, after the Second World War, when we were in this sort of economic crisis, and they built the NHS and invested our way out of it. That's what our government has to do. We've got this climate crisis. There needs to be massive investment in the Green New Deal, but you don't get through that by cutting people's wages, private sector or public sector wages.
But again, just explain to us what you have agreed with the government in July this year. Now, you mentioned starting salaries are supposed to be going up for the next 3 years.
Yeah.
Did that deal affect all teachers and all teaching assistants?
There is a bit of a mistake in what you've just said, Krishnan. We don't get to agree pay rises with our government. They impose them on us. There isn't a negotiation between teachers and government about their pay. There hasn't been since 1987. So the government just imposes pay rises every year. But what they said in the summer of last year was that they were so worried, the School Teacher Pay Review Body was so worried about teacher recruitment and retention, teachers leaving because of workload. We think that's going to be worse during this COVID crisis. And then having real difficulties finding teachers. The Teacher Review Body said that they needed to move up teacher starting salaries. And so the government, they said that they were going to increase them to 30,000 by 2 years from now, because they've done the first year of that. They weren't increasing other teacher salaries by anything like that. So they were going to squeeze the teacher pay spine, which is causing all sorts of issues.
And what about the lower paid people, the teaching assistants?
Nothing like that was offered for them. So if those people, if teaching assistants get squeezed by this, if teachers further up the pay spine get squeezed by this, if they abandon this pay rise for beginner teachers, it would be an outrage. But it's not just teachers and support staff. It is the prison officers. It is the police officers. It is that DWP worker. But I just want to go back and say again, they would spend their pay rises in private sector retail and private sector hairdressers and private sector hospitality.
But if you want to speak for all public sector workers, Kevin, I mean, do you accept that public sector workers are still ahead of the private sector and have been relatively protected during this crisis?
Most public sector workers haven't been furloughed. That's true. And But you can't say that public sector wages are ahead of private sector wages when the jobs are very different. But what you have to look at is everybody.
So you don't accept the comparison?
I don't accept the comparison. Pay has been held down for all working people in this country since the economic crisis of 2008, and it's not helping us get out of the economic crisis. There are some people who aren't suffering. We see the wealth of the most wealthy in our country continues to go up. We see people who get deals on delivery PPE.
Do you think there's a compromise, though? I mean, you know, a lot of private sector companies have had to look at pay rises and say, well, look, if you earn over a certain amount, if you earn more than £30,000, you're not going to get as big a pay rise as people who are earning less. Do you think when it comes to teaching, you're going to have to look at stratified pay deals?
Well, that is what we're looking at now. It's not a pay deal, it's a pay imposition, but the government currently is intending to put pay rises up more for the beginner teachers. We think that causes some problems, but you can see, you can see that lower paid people need to have their pay more protected than higher paid people, but that is not between the public and private sector and everybody. Every working person who's been putting themselves out during this crisis, they need a pay rise. And I think we have to think about the furlough as well. The furlough was a good step, but the furlough was actually, a major reason for doing it was that so people who were furloughed had pounds to spend in the shops.
Let me just
same argument now.
Yeah.
We need people to have money to spend in the private sector.
You've made that point a couple of times, but let me just change the subject for a moment and just ask you about one other aspect of teaching at the moment, which is this question around closing schools early for Christmas, in order to reduce transmission amongst students. Is that something you support as a union, as an idea?
I mean, we're hearing schools talk about it. We're hearing parents ask for it. So the discussion that's going on is happening because transmission rates are increasing in schools. We've been warning the government about this since September. We've been calling on them to reduce class sizes, to find extra teaching spaces, to have test, track, trace actually running in the schools. Those things haven't been done, and cases keep going up. And the number of outbreaks in secondary schools has now reached 2/3 of them. Cases shot up last week. There was a brief respite because of half term, and they're shooting up. And schools are worried that they will have to tell parents in that last week before Christmas that their child has been a close contact with somebody with the virus, and therefore the child and the parents have to self-isolate over the Christmas holiday. That's why the schools are thinking about it. What we're saying is that the government needs to break the chains of transmission in schools. And we think that we called for schools to be in this lockdown. The lockdown at the moment hasn't got the R rate below 1, according to the Cambridge nowcasting yesterday, and therefore cases aren't falling. And they are going up even faster in schools than elsewhere. In secondary schools, by the end of October, they'd gone up 50 times compared with the cases in September. It's not sustainable. Schools will fall over unless the government acts. So we're calling for school rotas. We're calling for a period of closure as part of the lockdown. Otherwise, schools will fall over.
Courtney from the National Education Union, thank you very much indeed.